The crimson nebula of the outer rim cast an eerie glow across the hull of the merchant vessel Prosperity's Dream. As it drifted through hyperspace, its cargo holds full of medical supplies destined for the colonies of Kepler Station. Among the 47 passengers aboard the ship was Dr. Sarah Chen, a xenobiologist returning from a research expedition, completely unaware that her life was about to intersect with one of the most notorious figures in galactic history, Vextar the Merciless, self-proclaimed pirate king of the void. The attack came without warning. The Prosperity's Dream was yanked from hyperspace by a massive gravity well projector, finding itself surrounded by a fleet of predatory vessels bearing the skull and plasma insignia of the Crimson Void pirates. The merchant ship's minimal defenses were no match for the pirates' superior firepower, and within minutes the hull was breached by boarding parties of various alien species united under Vextar's brutal banner. Captain Morrison of the Prosperity's Dream transmitted his surrender immediately, hoping to spare his passengers and crew unnecessary violence. But Vextar had not built his reputation on mercy. The Pirate King himself boarded the vessel, his towering Krathari form cutting an imposing figure as he strode through the corridors, standing nearly 8 feet tall, with chitinous armor plating covering his reptilian skin and forearms ending in razor-sharp claws. Vextar embodied the nightmare that haunted the dreams of merchants throughout the Outer Rim. "Humans," he hissed through his translator device, his serpentine tongue flicking out to taste the fear in the air. "Always so quick to surrender, so eager to preserve your fragile lives. Today, you will learn that mercy is a luxury I do not offer." The pirates herded the passengers and crew into the main cargo bay, where Vextar began his selection process. He was not interested in ransom money. Credits could be obtained through simpler acts of piracy. No, the Pirate King sought something far more valuable: leverage against the Terran Federation itself. His plan was as audacious as it was cruel. He would take a selection of human hostages to his fortress world of Keth Morin, where they would become pawns in his grand strategy to force the Federation to withdraw from several contested star systems. As Vextar's four eyes scanned the terrified crowd, his gaze fell upon several individuals who would serve his purposes well. There was Ambassador Elena Vasquez, returning from diplomatic negotiations with the Rigel Consortium. Her death would send shockwaves through the Federation's foreign ministry. Professor Marcus Webb, the renowned physicist whose research on quantum field manipulation was considered classified information. His knowledge alone made him invaluable. Commander Jackson Torres, a decorated war veteran whose capture would demoralize Federation forces throughout the sector. And then there was Dr. Sarah Chen. At first glance, she seemed an unremarkable choice. A xenobiologist in her early 30s, of average height and build, with shoulder-length black hair and intelligent dark eyes that reflected both fear and defiance. She wore the simple grey jumpsuit of a civilian researcher, and her only distinguishing feature was a small scar above her left eyebrow from a childhood accident. To most observers, she appeared to be just another terrified passenger caught in circumstances beyond her control. But Vextar had done his research. Dr. Chen was the daughter of Admiral Chen Wei-Ming, the architect of the Federation's successful defense of the Centauri system. Her father's military genius had cost Vextar several profitable raids and the lives of many of his most skilled lieutenants. Taking his daughter would be both strategically valuable and personally satisfying. "You," Vextar pointed at Sarah with one of his clawed appendages. "Step forward." Sarah's legs trembled as she moved toward the Pirate King, but her voice remained steady. "I'm just a scientist. I'm not worth anything to you." Vextar's laugh was a harsh, grating sound that echoed through the cargo bay. "On the contrary, Dr. Chen, you are worth everything to me. Your father's reputation precedes you both." The realization dawned in Sarah's eyes, but she showed no additional fear. Instead, she lifted her chin and met Vextar's gaze directly. "My father taught me that we are defined not by what happens to us, but by how we choose to respond." "How philosophical," Vextar sneered. "We shall see how your philosophy serves you in the dungeons of Keth Morin." In total, Vextar selected 12 hostages from the Prosperity's Dream, along with Sarah, Ambassador Vasquez, Professor Webb, and Commander Torres. He chose 8 others. A young engineer named David Park, whose father was a prominent senator, Dr. Lisa Armstrong, a medical researcher working on breakthrough treatments for genetic diseases, Captain Rebecca Hayes of the Merchant Marine, whose brother served on the Federation Council, businessman Richard Sterling, whose financial empire funded several Federation colonies, Maria Santos, a journalist whose expose on pirate activities had earned Vextar's personal enmity. Dr. James Mitchell, an archaeologist who had recently discovered artifacts from an ancient alien civilization. Lieutenant Sarah Foster, a communications specialist on leave from the Federation Navy. And teenage prodigy Alex Chen, no relation to Sarah, whose innovations in artificial intelligence had attracted both scientific acclaim and corporate interest. As the hostages were transferred to Vextar's flagship, the Damnation's Edge, Sarah observed everything with the trained eye of a scientist. She noted the ship's layout, the behavior patterns of different alien crew members, and most importantly, the psychological profile of their captor. Vextar ruled through fear and intimidation, but Sarah detected something else beneath his cruel exterior, a deep-seated insecurity that manifested as an obsessive need to prove his superiority over humans. The journey to Kethmoran took 5 days. During this time, the hostages were kept in a communal holding cell equipped with basic life support and minimal amenities. The conditions were deliberately harsh. Vextar wanted to break their spirits before they reached his fortress world. Most of the hostages spent their time in despair, some weeping openly, others retreating into themselves. But Sarah used the time differently. She began to study her fellow prisoners, learning their strengths and weaknesses, their fears and motivations. She discovered that Ambassador Vasquez, despite her diplomatic training, was prone to panic attacks in confined spaces. Professor Webb was brilliant but physically frail and dependent on medication for a heart condition. Commander Torres had battlefield experience but was haunted by memories of previous defeats. Each person carried their own burden of weakness, their own vulnerability that Vextar would inevitably exploit. But Sarah also saw potential. David Park was young and frightened, but he had an engineer's mind and an intuitive understanding of mechanical systems. Dr. Armstrong possessed medical knowledge that could be crucial in any escape attempt. Captain Hayes had survival training and experience in hostile environments. Even the teenager Alex Chen, despite his youth, had a keen intellect and an almost supernatural ability with computer systems. Sarah began to organize them, not through speeches or grand gestures, but through small acts of kindness and quiet words of encouragement. When Ambassador Vasquez suffered a panic attack during a particularly rough section of hyperspace travel, Sarah held her hand and taught her breathing techniques to regain control. When Professor Webb ran low on his heart medication, she helped him ration the remaining pills and showed him exercises to reduce stress on his cardiovascular system. When Commander Torres began to spiral into self-recrimination about past failures, she reminded him of the lives he had saved and the victories he had won. "The man who destroys his weak self can never be destroyed by others," she told them one evening as they huddled together in their cell. "My grandmother used to say that to me when I was young. I never fully understood what she meant until now." "What does it mean?" asked David Park, his voice barely above a whisper. Sarah looked around at her fellow prisoners, seeing the mixture of hope and despair in their faces. "It means that our greatest enemy isn't Vextar or his pirates. It's the voice in our head that tells us we're helpless, that we're victims, that we have no choice but to suffer whatever fate others decide for us." "But that voice is lying." "We always have a choice, even when it doesn't feel like it." Captain Hayes, who had remained largely silent during their captivity, spoke up. "Easy words to say when we're locked in a cage. The cage is just metal and energy fields," Sarah replied. "The real prison is the one we build in our minds. Vextar wants us to believe we're powerless, that we're nothing more than bargaining chips in his game. But he's wrong. Every moment we maintain our dignity, every time we choose hope over despair, every act of kindness we show each other, these are victories he can never take away from us." "Dr. Mitchell," the archaeologist nodded thoughtfully. "In my studies of ancient civilizations, I've seen this pattern repeated countless times. The societies that survived great catastrophes weren't necessarily the strongest or most advanced. They were the ones who maintained their humanity in the face of dehumanizing circumstances." As the Damnation's Edge approached Kethmoran, Sarah could feel a change in her fellow hostages. They were still afraid, only a fool wouldn't be afraid, but the paralyzing terror that had initially consumed them was giving way to something else: determination. They began to share information about their various skills and knowledge, forming the foundation of what might become a resistance cell. Kethmoran itself was a testament to Vextar's cruelty and megalomania. The planet had once been a thriving agricultural world, home to a peaceful species called the Morthani. Vextar had conquered it decades ago, enslaving the native population and transforming their beautiful cities into industrial complexes that served his pirate fleet. The main fortress, built atop the ruins of the Morthani capital, was a massive structure of black metal and red crystal that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. The hostages were separated upon arrival, each assigned to individual cells in different sections of the fortress. This was a calculated move by Vexstar to prevent them from organizing or drawing strength from each other. But Sarah had anticipated this. During their final hours together on the ship, she had established a simple communication system using a combination of tapping codes and visual signals that could be transmitted through the fortress's ventilation system. Sarah's cell was located in the high-security wing, a sterile chamber equipped with a force field barrier instead of traditional bars. The room contained a simple cot, a waste disposal unit, and a water dispenser. A small window looked out over the fortress courtyard, where she could see Morthani slaves toiling under the watchful eyes of alien guards. For the first week, Vexstar left the hostages alone, allowing them to contemplate their situation and, he hoped, despair. But Sarah used this time to study the fortress. She observed the guard rotations, mapped the movement patterns of various personnel, and identified potential weaknesses in the facility's security. Through her improvised communication system, she shared this information with the other hostages and began to learn about their own observations and discoveries. Ambassador Vasquez, despite her initial panic attacks, had managed to engage some of the guards in conversation and learned valuable information about the fortress's command structure. Professor Webb had noticed that the energy grid powering their cells showed fluctuations at regular intervals, suggesting potential vulnerabilities. Commander Torres had identified several tactical weaknesses in the guard deployment. Each hostage contributed something to their growing understanding of their prison. On the 8th day of their captivity, Vexstar made his first visit to Sarah's cell. The Pirate King arrived with considerable fanfare, accompanied by his lieutenant commanders and a small army of guards. He wore ornate armor decorated with the bones and trophies of his victims, and his 4 arms bore weapons that could kill in dozens of different ways. "Dr. Sarden, Sarah Chen," he said, his voice dripping with mock courtesy. "I trust you are finding your accommodations adequate?" "I've stayed in worse places," Sarah replied, sitting calmly on her cot and showing no signs of intimidation, though the room service leaves something to be desired. Vexstar's eyes narrowed. He had expected cowering and pleading, not casual defiance. "Your father should have taught you more respect for your betters." "My father taught me to respect those who earn it through their actions, not those who demand it through violence." The Pirate King's claws extended reflexively, scoring gouges in the metal floor. "Perhaps you do not fully understand your situation. You are not guests here. You are prisoners, hostages, bargaining chips in a game far larger than your small human mind can comprehend. Your lives hang by the thinnest of threads, and I hold the blade that will cut them." Sarah stood slowly, moving to within arm's reach of the force field barrier. When she spoke, her voice was steady and filled with quiet conviction. "You're wrong about something fundamental, Vexstar. You think you hold our lives in your hands, but you don't. You can kill our bodies, certainly. You can torture us, starve us, make us suffer in countless ways. But you cannot touch what makes us human. You cannot destroy our dignity, our compassion, our hope, or our love for each other. Those things exist beyond your reach, and they make us stronger than you could ever be." For a moment, something flickered in Vexstar's alien eyes. Surprise, perhaps, or uncertainty, but it was quickly replaced by rage. "We shall see how strong you feel after a few months in solitary confinement with nothing but bread and water to sustain you. Then I'll use the time to think about the people I love and the life I want to build when this is over," Sarah replied. "Will you be able to say the same?" Vexstar turned and stalked away without another word, but Sarah could see that her words had struck home. The Pirate King ruled through fear, and fear only worked when people believed they had something to lose. But Sarah had found something that Vexstar could never take away, the understanding that her true self existed independent of her circumstances. True to his threat, Vexstar ordered Sarah moved to solitary confinement. Her new cell was smaller and completely isolated, with no window and no possibility of communication with the other hostages. The light was kept dim around the clock, and her food was reduced to basic subsistence rations. Most prisoners would have broken within days, but Sarah had prepared for this possibility. Instead of allowing despair to consume her, she used the isolation as an opportunity for reflection and mental training. She practiced meditation techniques she had learned during her research expeditions to hostile worlds. She reviewed her scientific knowledge, working through complex biological problems in her head. She composed letters to her family and friends even though she might never be able to send them. Most importantly, she visualized her fellow hostages, sending them mental messages of encouragement and strength. Unknown to Vexstar, Sarah's example had already begun to spread throughout the fortress. The other hostages, inspired by her courage, had begun to resist in their own ways. Ambassador Vasquez used her diplomatic skills to improve conditions for the Morthani slaves, gradually building a network of allies among the oppressed population. Professor Webb pretended to cooperate with pirate scientists who wanted access to his knowledge, while secretly sabotaging their research. Commander Torres began training other prisoners in basic self-defense and tactical thinking. But it was the youngest hostage, Alex Chen, who made the most significant breakthrough. Using his knowledge of computer systems and some improvised components salvaged from his cell's waste disposal unit, he managed to hack into the fortress's communication array. For just a few minutes each day, during the gap in the security sweeps, he could access the network and gather intelligence about Vexstar's operations. What Alex discovered was both alarming and encouraging. Vexstar's pirate confederation was larger and more organized than the Federation had realized, with raids planned against dozens of civilian targets. But the intelligence also revealed weaknesses, supply shortages, internal disputes among different alien factions, and growing unrest among the enslaved populations on worlds under pirate control. Most importantly, Alex learned that Federation forces were actively searching for the hostages. Admiral Chen had personally led a task force into the Outer Rim, following every lead and chasing every rumor about his daughter's whereabouts. The pirates were feeling the pressure, and several of Vexstar's lieutenants had begun to question the wisdom of antagonizing such a determined enemy. After 3 weeks in solitary confinement, Sarah was returned to the general population. She had lost weight and her face was pale from the lack of sunlight, but her spirit remained unbroken. If anything, the experience had strengthened her resolve. She had spent hours in meditation, confronting every fear and weakness within herself, and she had emerged with a clarity of purpose that seemed to radiate from her very being. The reunion with her fellow hostages was emotional but brief. They had work to do. Using the intelligence that Alex had gathered, and the connections that Ambassador Vasquez had built with the Morthani slaves, Sarah began to develop an escape plan that was audacious in its scope. They would not simply flee the fortress, they would liberate it entirely, freeing not just themselves but all of the enslaved beings under Vexstar's control. The plan required careful coordination and split-second timing. Dr. Armstrong would use her medical knowledge to synthesize a sedative from materials available in the fortress's medical bay, which Ambassador Vasquez would introduce into the guard's food supply during a shift change. Professor Webb would overload the fortress's main power grid at precisely the right moment, causing a cascade failure that would disable security systems throughout the complex. Commander Torres would lead a diversionary attack on the main armory, drawing attention away from the real objective. Captain Hayes would coordinate the evacuation of prisoners through the fortress's maintenance tunnels. David Park would disable the planetary defense grid to prevent orbital bombardment during their escape. Sarah's role was perhaps the most dangerous. She would confront Vexstar directly, keeping the Pirate King occupied while the others executed their parts of the plan. It was a task that required not physical strength or tactical brilliance, but something far more difficult: the ability to defeat an enemy through the sheer force of moral conviction. The escape began at dawn on a day when the fortress was bustling with activity. A large raiding fleet was preparing to depart for attacks on Federation colonies, and the distraction provided perfect cover for the hostages' activities. One by one, each element of the plan fell into place with precision timing that would have impressed the most experienced military commanders. Dr. Armstrong's sedative worked exactly as planned, causing key guards to fall unconscious at their posts. Professor Webb's power overload cascaded through the fortress's systems, disabling force fields and automated defenses. Commander Torres' diversionary attack drew hundreds of guards away from critical areas. The liberation was proceeding flawlessly. But Vexstar was no ordinary opponent. The Pirate King had survived decades of warfare through cunning and ruthlessness, and he quickly realized what was happening. Racing to his command center with his personal guard, he began to re-establish control over the fortress's systems. Within minutes, he had isolated the power failures and begun to restore security measures. It was then that Sarah appeared in the command center doorway, walking calmly past the bodies of unconscious guards. She wore the simple gray jumpsuit of a civilian researcher, and her only weapon was the quiet confidence that radiated from her presence. "Hello, Vexstar," she said, as if greeting an old friend. "I think it's time we finished our conversation." The Pirate King spun around, his forearms reaching for weapons, but something in Sarah's demeanor made him pause. She showed no fear, no aggression, no desperation. Instead, she seemed almost serene, as if she had found something that made her invulnerable to his threats. "You think you can defeat me, little human?" Vextar snarled, his claws extending. "I am the terror of 1,000 worlds. I have killed beings far stronger and more dangerous than you could ever be." "I'm not here to fight you, Vextar," Sarah replied, stepping closer to the massive alien. "I'm here to offer you something far more valuable than victory. The chance to become more than you are." Vextar's laugh was a harsh, grating sound. "You offer me nothing but death. When I finish with you, I will hunt down every one of your fellow escapees and make them pay for this insurrection with suffering beyond your imagination." "No, you won't," Sarah said with absolute certainty. "Because you're going to let us go. All of us. Not just the human hostages, but every enslaved being on this world. You're going to dissolve your pirate confederation and find a new way to live." The Pirate King's eyes widened with incredulous rage. "Have you lost your mind completely? I am Vextar the Merciless." "I bow to no one." Sarah moved closer still, now standing within easy reach of Vextar's claws. When she spoke, her voice was soft but carried the weight of absolute conviction. "You're not merciless, Vextar. You're terrified. Terrified that without the fear and respect that comes from violence, you're nothing. Terrified that your followers will abandon you if you show any sign of weakness. Terrified that deep down, you're just as afraid and alone as everyone else." For the first time in decades, Vextar found himself backing away from another being. "You know nothing about me, human. I know that you were exiled from your homeworld for crimes against your own people. I know that you've spent your entire adult life trying to prove that you're stronger than those who rejected you. I know that you surround yourself with beings who fear you because you can't bear to be around anyone who might see through your mask of cruelty to the frightened child underneath." Vextar's claws were fully extended now, trembling with rage and something that might have been fear. "Stop talking! I know that you built this fortress on the ruins of a peaceful civilization because you couldn't stand to see others living the kind of life that was denied to you. I know that you take hostages instead of simply killing your enemies because some part of you still hopes that someone, somewhere, will care enough about another being to sacrifice for them." "I said stop talking!" Vextar roared, raising all forearms to strike. Sarah didn't flinch. Instead, she looked directly into his alien eyes and said the words that would change everything. "I know that you're capable of being better than this. I know that beneath all the anger and violence, there's still a part of you that wants to build something instead of destroying it. I know because I can see it in your eyes right now." Vextar's arms froze in mid-strike. For a long moment, the command center was silent, except for the hum of machinery and the distant sounds of combat as the liberation continued throughout the fortress. The Pirate King stood frozen, his claws mere inches from Sarah's face, his entire body trembling with internal conflict. "You see the truth about me," he whispered finally. "But truth changes nothing. I am what I am. I have gone too far down this path to turn back now. The man who destroys his weak self can never be destroyed by others," Sarah said gently. "It's not too late, Vextar. You can choose to be someone different. You can choose to be better." Something broke inside the Pirate King. His arms fell to his sides, and for the first time in decades, his fierce expression crumbled. "The things I have done, the worlds I have burned, the lives I have taken, how can someone like me ever be redeemed?" "Redemption isn't about erasing the past," Sarah replied. "It's about choosing to write a different future. Help us, Vextar. Help us free your prisoners, disband your fleet, find a new way to live. Show the galaxy that even the most feared pirate king can choose to become something better." What happened next would be debated by historians and philosophers for generations. Vextar, the terror of the Outer Rim, the being whose very name struck fear into the hearts of civilians throughout the galaxy, slowly sank to his knees before a young human woman who had offered him something no one else ever had: hope for transformation. "What would you have me do?" he asked, his voice barely audible. Sarah knelt beside him, placing a gentle hand on one of his massive arms. "First, we free everyone. Every slave, every prisoner, every being held against their will. Then we contact the Federation and arrange for peaceful surrenders. Your followers who want to start new lives will be given that chance. Those who insist on continuing their piracy will be dealt with by Federation justice. And me? Vexstar asked. What becomes of the Pirate King? Sarah smiled, and for the first time since their ordeal began, it was a smile of genuine joy. That depends on who you choose to become. The liberation of Kathmoran proceeded with unprecedented cooperation from its former ruler. Vexstar personally ordered his forces to stand down, opened the fortress's prisons, and transmitted surrender signals to his fleet. The transformation was so complete and so unexpected that many of his own lieutenants initially refused to believe the orders were genuine. When Admiral Chen's task force arrived 3 days later, they found a world in the midst of peaceful revolution. The Morthani slaves had been freed and were working with Federation personnel to establish a new planetary government. Most of Vexstar's pirate fleet had scattered to the far reaches of space, but a significant number of his followers had chosen to surrender and seek amnesty in exchange for information about other criminal operations. The 12 human hostages were in remarkable condition considering their ordeal. More importantly, they had become something more than mere survivors. They had become catalysts for change that would ripple throughout the galaxy. Ambassador Vasquez would go on to pioneer new diplomatic protocols for dealing with hostile alien cultures. Professor Webb would develop revolutionary new technologies for peaceful space exploration. Commander Torres would establish training programs that taught Federation personnel how to maintain their humanity even in the most dire circumstances. But it was Sarah Chen who became the most celebrated figure to emerge from the Kethnaran incident. Her doctoral thesis on the psychological factors that enable moral transformation under extreme duress would become required reading at military academies and diplomatic schools throughout the Federation. Her techniques for maintaining psychological resilience in captivity would save countless lives in future conflicts. Most remarkably, Sarah maintained a correspondence with Vexstar throughout his rehabilitation and eventual integration into galactic society. The former Pirate King would spend years making amends for his crimes, working to free other enslaved populations and establishing refugee programs for beings displaced by piracy. Under Sarah's guidance, he would eventually become one of the Federation's most effective advocates for criminal justice reform. The transformation of Vexstar the Merciless into Vexstar the Redeemer would be studied by sociologists and psychologists for centuries. How could a being responsible for so much death and suffering change so completely? The answer, according to Dr. Chen's analysis, lay in understanding the fundamental principle she had learned from her grandmother. The man who destroys his weak self can never be destroyed by others. Vexstar had built his entire identity around fear, both the fear he instilled in others and the fear he felt about his own inadequacy. But when Sarah showed him that he could choose to be defined by something other than violence, that he could find strength in compassion rather than cruelty, she had given him the tools to destroy the weak, frightened being he had been and replace it with someone stronger. The principle worked for the other hostages as well. Each of them had faced their deepest fears and limitations during their captivity. Ambassador Vasquez had overcome her panic attacks and found courage she never knew she possessed. Professor Webb had discovered that his physical frailty was irrelevant compared to his moral strength. Commander Torres had learned that true leadership meant inspiring others rather than simply commanding them. Sarah herself had undergone the most profound transformation. The young scientist who had boarded the Prosperity's Dream had been competent and intelligent, but relatively ordinary. The woman who emerged from the dungeons of Kethmoran had become something extraordinary, not through any external power or advantage, but through the simple recognition that she could choose who she wanted to be regardless of her circumstances. In her final report to the Galactic Historical Commission, Sarah would write, "We often speak of human exceptionalism in terms of our technological achievements or our military victories. But our true strength lies not in what we can build or destroy, but in our capacity to transform ourselves and others through acts of moral courage. When we choose compassion over hatred, hope over despair, and love over fear, we become capable of miracles that no weapon or machine could ever accomplish." The Kethmoran incident would mark a turning point in the relationship between the Federation and the various pirate organizations operating in the Outer Rim. Traditional military responses had failed to eliminate the threat of piracy, often creating new grievances and recruiting more desperate beings to the criminal lifestyle. But Sarah's approach, addressing the underlying psychological and social factors that drove beings to piracy, proved far more effective. Within 5 years of the incident, piracy in the Outer Rim had decreased by over 60%. Many former pirates had accepted Federation amnesty programs and found legitimate employment. Others had established new colonies on frontier worlds, far from the temptations of their old lives. Most remarkably, several former pirate leaders had become advocates for peaceful conflict resolution, using their knowledge of criminal psychology to help law enforcement agencies prevent recruitment into pirate organizations. The success of these programs led to the establishment of the Chen Institute for Conflict Resolution, a Federation-sponsored organization dedicated to applying psychological insights to diplomatic and security challenges. The institute would train thousands of personnel and techniques for de-escalating conflicts, rehabilitating criminals, and building bridges between hostile cultures. But perhaps the most important legacy of the Kethmoran incident was the recognition that true strength comes not from the ability to destroy one's enemies, but from the courage to help them become something better. Sarah Chen had faced one of the most feared beings in the galaxy, armed with nothing but compassion and moral conviction, and she had achieved what entire fleets of warships had failed to accomplish. The principle she had learned from her grandmother, that the man who destroys his weak self can never be destroyed by others, became a cornerstone of Federation philosophy. It was taught in schools, discussed in philosophical circles, and applied in countless situations where beings face seemingly insurmountable challenges. The idea was simple but profound. External circumstances, no matter how dire, could not touch the core of who a person chose to be. Physical prisons, psychological torture, social rejection, economic hardship, all of these were temporary conditions that affected the body and mind but could not reach the essential self. Only by refusing to accept the limitations imposed by fear, hatred, and despair could a being truly become invulnerable to the power others sought to hold over them. This principle had practical applications far beyond hostage situations or criminal rehabilitation. Students facing academic pressure learned that their worth was not determined by grades or external validation. Business leaders discovered that ethical behavior was not only morally correct but also strategically advantageous in building sustainable organizations. Military personnel found that maintaining their humanity in combat made them more effective soldiers, not weaker ones. The transformation of Vexstar became a symbol of the potential that existed within every being. No matter how far they had fallen or how much damage they had caused, if the most feared pirate king in galactic history could choose to become a force for peace and justice, then no one was beyond redemption. This understanding fundamentally changed how the Federation approached conflicts with hostile alien cultures, criminal organizations, and even internal social problems. Sarah Chen's story became required study at the Federation Naval Academy, but not as an example of military heroics or tactical brilliance. Instead, it was taught as a demonstration of moral courage, the willingness to see the potential for good in others even when they could not see it themselves, and the strength to maintain one's principles even under the most extreme circumstances. The lesson was clear. True victory did not come from defeating one's enemies, but from helping them become allies. True strength was not measured in terms of destructive capability, but in the capacity to build, heal, and transform. And true heroism was not about grand gestures or dramatic sacrifices, but about the daily choice to respond to hatred with love, to fear with courage, and to despair with hope. Years later, when Sarah was asked to reflect on her experience as Vexstar's hostage, she would often return to her grandmother's wisdom. "The man who destroys his weak self can never be destroyed by others," she would say. But this principle has a corollary that is equally important. The person who helps others destroy their weak selves becomes truly invincible, because they become part of something larger than themselves, the endless human capacity for growth, transformation, and redemption. The galaxy was a dangerous place, filled with beings who chose violence over peace, hatred over love, and destruction over creation. But Sarah Chen and the 11 other hostages who survived the Kethmuran incident had proven that even in the darkest circumstances, even when faced with the most implacable enemies, human beings possessed something that no weapon could match and no force could overcome: the power to choose who they wanted to be. And in making that choice, they had not only freed themselves from physical captivity, but had liberated their captor from the prison of his own hatred and fear. In the end, that was the greatest victory of all. Not the conquest of an enemy, but the transformation of an enemy into a friend. The Pirate King had taken hostages, but in the end, it was the hostages who had taken him, not as a prisoner, but as a human being, finally ready to join the community of beings dedicated to building a better galaxy for all. This was the true meaning of human strength. Not the ability to destroy what was evil, but the courage to help it become good. Not the power to resist corruption, but the wisdom to heal it. Not the capacity to survive in a hostile universe, but the determination to make that universe a little less hostile for everyone. In her final analysis of the Keth Moran incident, Sarah Chen would conclude, "We did not defeat Vextar the Merciless through superior firepower or tactical brilliance. We defeated him by refusing to accept that mercy was a weakness, that compassion was naive, or that hope was foolish. We defeated him by insisting that even the most feared pirate king in the galaxy was capable of becoming something better. And in that defeat, we all found victory, not just for ourselves, but for every being in the galaxy who still believed that transformation was possible." The document closes with a simple notation: personal effects recovered from Dr. Sarah Chen's quarters on Keth Moran included a small, handwritten note in her grandmother's distinctive script. The note contained only 8 words. "You are stronger than you know, little star." Dr. Chen reportedly kept this note with her throughout her captivity and for the rest of her distinguished career. It now resides in the Federation Museum of Human Achievement, displayed alongside artifacts from other instances of extraordinary human resilience. Visitors often remark that the simple piece of paper seems to radiate the same quiet strength that enabled a young scientist to transform one of the galaxy's most feared criminals into one of its most dedicated advocates for peace. The legacy of the Keth Moran incident continues to influence Federation policy and philosophy to this day. The Chen Institute for Conflict Resolution operates facilities on over 100 worlds, training millions of beings in the principles of transformative justice and compassionate leadership. Former pirates, reformed criminals, and rehabilitated extremists work alongside traditional law enforcement personnel to create a galaxy where every being has the opportunity to become their best self. And somewhere in the Outer Rim, on a small agricultural world that was once a pirate stronghold, an aging Krithari tends to gardens that feed refugee populations throughout the sector. The beings he once terrorized now call him friend, and children who have never known war play safely in the shade of trees he planted with his own 4 hands. When visitors ask how such a transformation was possible, he points to a small plaque mounted near the garden's entrance. The inscription, carved in a dozen different languages, reads simply, "The man who destroys his weak self can never be destroyed by others." Below it, in smaller script, is the attribution, "Words of wisdom from Grandmother Chen, as shared by Dr. Sarah Chen, who showed us all that redemption is always possible." Thus concludes the documented account of one of the most remarkable incidents in galactic history, a story that began with an act of piracy and ended with an act of transformation that would echo through the ages. It stands as testament to the truth that Sarah Chen discovered in the depths of a pirate fortress, that human strength lies not in our ability to destroy our enemies. In the end, that may be the greatest victory any being can achieve.